Weeks after Nolan Wells died, a letter started circulating online, handwritten, several pages, claiming to lay out, in someone's own words, exactly what happened between him and the friends he went to Horn Island with, and why. For a case that has had almost no public answers, that letter looked, to a lot of people, like the missing piece. It was shared thousands of times, read aloud on video, broken down line by strangers convinced they'd finally found the truth nobody else was telling them. Here's what we can tell you tonight. Before anything else, no investigator has authenticated that letter. No law enforcement agency has confirmed it's real, and Mississippi officials have already gone on the record, publicly, warning that fabricated documents designed to look exactly like this one are circulating in this exact case. That doesn't mean nothing in it is true. It means, right now, nobody actually knows. Today, we're laying out what's actually confirmed in the case of Nolan Wells, starting with that letter and why it deserves far more scrutiny than it's gotten. For everyone else, stay with us, because separating what's real from what's convincing is exactly what this documentary is built to do. If you want to follow this case as new, verified information comes in, subscribe now. This is far from finished. And drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. This is the case of Nolan Wells, and the letter that never should have gone this far unquestioned. Let's start with the document itself, because almost everything people believe they know about this case right now traces back to it. The letter began appearing online in the weeks following Nolan's death, allegedly written by someone close to the group of friends who had traveled with him to Horn Island. Across several pages, it describes a prior conflict between Nolan and one of the young men in the group, references tension the writer claims had been building for some time, and implies, without stating it outright, that this tension played some role in what ultimately happened. Read on its own, without any context around it, it feels like exactly the missing piece this case has been waiting for. A motive, apparently handed to the public in someone's own handwriting. Here is what actually matters about that letter, stated plainly, without hedging. As of right now, it has not been authenticated by a single law enforcement agency, not by a single official connected to the investigation, not by a single established news outlet with the standards to verify something like this before publishing it. Its author is unknown. Its origin is unknown. Nobody investigating this case has confirmed it's genuine, and nobody has been able to publicly trace where it actually came from. That gap in verification isn't an isolated coincidence. It fits directly into a pattern officials in this exact case have already addressed, before this letter even surfaced. Mississippi's Department of Public Safety Commissioner has confirmed, on the record, that fabricated documents have been circulating specifically in connection with this case, including fake toxicology reports, designed and formatted to look convincingly official, aimed at an audience desperate for any concrete answer. An attorney representing one of the young men involved echoed that same warning independently, publicly urging people not to trust unverified paperwork claiming to reveal insider details about an ongoing investigation. To be clear, none of this proves every claim about this case is false. But it does mean this specific letter, however detailed or emotionally convincing it may read, currently has no verification behind it whatsoever. The warning about material like this didn't come after the letter appeared, as reactive damage control. It came from officials speaking generally about exactly this kind of document, and that warning applies here directly, without exception. So before we go any further into what's actually confirmed about Nolan Wells, we wanted you to know that, because the rest of this documentary is going to hold every claim to that same standard, sourced or labeled clearly as unverified, nothing in between. With that established, let's set the letter aside completely and look at what has actually been confirmed on the record by named people, starting from the beginning. There is one detail in this case that does not come from anonymous accounts, deleted posts, or documents nobody can trace back to a real person. It comes from named individuals speaking on the record, describing two very different versions of the exact same afternoon. According to a young woman named Katie, that conversation was simple, almost forgettable in the moment. Nolan told her directly that he planned to leave the island the same way he'd arrived, back on the boat, with the group of friends he had spent the entire day with. That is her account. Not a rumor passed secondhand, not something reconstructed from screenshots, a statement she gave, attributed to her by name, and later referenced publicly by the family's attorney as one of the central, unresolved pieces of this case. The friends who had traveled with Nolan described something else entirely. According to them, Nolan made his own decision, independently, to stay behind that evening, to remain on the island with Katie rather than return with the group. In their version of events, there was no tension, no disagreement, no reason for anyone to think twice about it. Just a young man choosing to stay a little longer at a party that showed no sign of slowing down. Sit with that for a moment, because this is the detail this entire case turns on. Two named people, two accounts of the same specific moment in time, and so far, not one explanation for why they don't line up. This is also the point in the investigation where Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, says she noticed something that, on its own, might have meant nothing at all, but combined with everything else, it became something she couldn't put down. When Nolan's phone was eventually returned to the family, she did what any parent in that position would likely do. She went through it, slowly, looking for anything that might tell her more about her son's final hours. Photos, videos, some small, ordinary trace of the day he'd spent surrounded by friends, on the water, under a sky that would later fill with fireworks he never got to see. She found nothing. No saved images from the boat ride out, no clips from the island itself, nothing from an afternoon that, by every single account given to investigators, involved hundreds of people, music, laughter, and hours of activity. Not one photo, not one video. For most families, an empty camera roll might not raise a single question. Phones run out of storage, people forget to charge them, days get busy, and nobody documents every hour of it. But for this family, it did raise a question, because of who Nolan was. His parents have said, publicly and more than once, that documenting moments like this wasn't occasional for their son. It wasn't something he did only on special occasions. It was constant. Nearly every gathering, nearly every trip, nearly every ordinary Tuesday that felt worth capturing. Friends who knew him have echoed the same thing, that Nolan was the one with his phone out, catching the small moments most people forget to record. A habit so consistent, so built into who he was, that its sudden, total absence on the one day it would have mattered most felt to his mother like something had been deliberately taken away, not simply lost. Attorney Ben Crump, representing the family, has pointed to this same detail as one of the clearest signs that the official account, as it currently stands, does not fully add up. Alongside the missing photos, Crump has noted publicly that Nolan's phone and keys were left behind with the group after he went missing, that messages on his accounts appeared to have been deleted, and that at least one witness has come forward with information that directly contradicts what investigators initially released to the public. We want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a story like this can tip from documentation into speculation, and we're not willing to make that leap for you. None of what we've just laid out proves what happened to Nolan Wells. It does not, on its own, point to any single person or any single explanation. But it is not rumor either. It is not something pulled from an anonymous account with no name attached. It is a documented, named, on-the-record contradiction sitting at the very center of a case that, weeks later, authorities still have not resolved, and a mother still cannot fully explain to herself. Somewhere in that gap between two accounts and one empty phone, a family is still waiting. Not for justice necessarily, not yet, not until the facts are known, just for the truth, whatever shape it eventually takes. Grief, in most cases like this, unfolds quietly. A family mourns, a community gathers briefly, and the world moves on within a matter of weeks. That is not what happened here. As questions around Nolan's final hours grew louder, the response around them grew just as quickly, and it did not stay quiet for long. Within days of his body being recovered, Nolan's family made a decision that signaled, unmistakably, they were not prepared to accept a quiet resolution to their son's death. They retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump, a name many recognized immediately, from other cases involving young black men and women whose deaths raised difficult, painful questions about how seriously and how fairly they had been investigated. Crump's involvement was not just a legal decision, it was a message delivered to everyone watching. This family intended to push for answers, publicly and persistently, for as long as it took to get them. Public pressure followed almost immediately behind him, arriving in a way few families in this position ever experience. At Nolan's funeral, in a moment that must have been almost unbearable to sit through as a grieving parent, Reverend Al Sharpton stood before the family and announced a reward of $50,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Filmmaker Tyler Perry matched that same amount days later. Then, weeks into the case, NFL Hall of Famer Terrell Owens added $25,000 of his own, pushing the total reward to $125,000, an amount large enough on its own to keep this case in national headlines week after week, long after most stories like it would have quietly faded. Crump has described the growing support not as spectacle, but as a message to the family that their son's death would not be quietly forgotten, filed away, or allowed to disappear from public attention the way so many similar cases have before. Sharpton, for his part, has been careful and consistent in his public statements, saying that the family isn't looking to assign blame before the facts are fully known, only to make sure that whatever the truth turns out to be, it actually comes out, in the open, where it can't be buried. On the investigative side, this case has moved well beyond a handful of routine interviews. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has confirmed publicly that his detectives have spoken with approximately 60 witnesses connected to the day Nolan disappeared, including in-depth interviews with the friends who were with him on the boat. The FBI has also stepped in to assist, examining digital evidence tied to that day, phones, messages, and records, a level of federal involvement that is not typical in every missing person case that turns fatal, and one that speaks to how seriously this case is now being treated at multiple levels. And yet, despite all of that activity, despite 60 witnesses and federal assistance and a reward climbing into six figures, one of the most basic facts in any death investigation is still being withheld from the public. More than a month after Nolan's body was recovered, the official cause and manner of his death have not been released. Prosecutors in Jackson County have stated plainly that these results will remain sealed until the case is formally presented to a grand jury, a process with no fixed timeline, no announced date, and no guarantee of when it will conclude. That silence has left a family in an almost impossible position, grieving, but without a single official answer to hold on to, watching a case gain national attention while still not knowing, in any confirmed sense, how their son actually died. That silence has not gone unchallenged either. The Mississippi chapter of the NACAP issued a public statement urging investigators to pursue every lead without bias or delay, specifically citing what they called deeply concerning contradictions in the initial accounts of what happened that day. Nolan's family has echoed that same demand in nearly every public appearance since his death, and it is worth noting exactly how they've chosen to phrase it, every single time. Not an accusation, not a predetermined conclusion about what happened or who is responsible, just a consistent, repeated request for the full truth, delivered without prejudice in either direction, and without demanding that the truth match any particular outcome before it's even known. For a grieving family, that request should not be complicated to fulfill. It is, by any reasonable standard, the most basic thing a family could ask for after losing a child under circumstances nobody has fully explained. Weeks in, it still hasn't been. If this is the kind of case where you'd rather understand what's actually been verified than what's simply being repeated the loudest online, this channel is built around exactly that approach. Sourced first, every time, with speculation clearly labeled as speculation, never blended in as if it carries the same weight as confirmed fact. If that approach matters to you, consider subscribing before we move into the next part of this case, because what's circulating online from this point forward is where this story gets significantly more complicated and significantly more important to get right. We already walked through the letter at the top of this documentary, but it isn't the only claim moving through this case with no verification behind it, and the rest deserve the same scrutiny. The first shifts from paper to video. An independent investigator, active primarily on TikTok, has spent weeks analyzing footage from the day Nolan disappeared, arguing, frame by frame, that certain clips show signs of digital manipulation. As part of that analysis, she has also claimed there was a fourth boat present that day, one she says is entirely unaccounted for in the timeline investigators have released publicly. Her videos have been shared widely, encouraging viewers to look closely at shadows, reflections, and small visual inconsistencies as evidence that something in the official footage was deliberately altered by someone with something to hide. To date, no major news outlet has reported or corroborated this theory in any form. That silence is worth sitting with on its own. But there's an additional layer of context that makes this particular claim even more complicated than it first appears, and it's context that actually undermines the theory rather than supporting it. Independently of this specific claim about a fourth boat, this case has already developed a well-documented, confirmed problem with fake content circulating online. Multiple established news organizations have reported that AI-generated images and videos related to Nolan Wells have been spreading across social media, misleading viewers who had no reasonable way of knowing what they were actually looking at or realizing the footage in front of them had never actually happened. That confirmed reality doesn't strengthen the fourth boat theory. If anything, it complicates it significantly. If AI-generated content is already known, confirmed, and documented to be circulating in connection with this exact case, then footage that appears altered could just as easily be one of those already known fabrications, rather than evidence of a coordinated cover-up carried out by the actual people who were there that day. In other words, the presence of AI-generated fakes in this case is a confirmed, established fact. Whether any specific clip was deliberately altered by the individuals appearing in it, as opposed to being a separate piece of manufactured misinformation entirely, is not confirmed at all. The second claim reaches furthest from anything directly tied to what actually happened on that boat. A theory circulating online attempts to connect a local family's ancestry, tracing back to a former Mississippi governor's administration decades in the past, with the professional history of an attorney currently involved in the case, who reportedly once held roles with well-known conservative political organizations. The theory suggests these connections offer some kind of explanation for why the investigation has unfolded the way it has, and why concrete answers have been slow to arrive for a grieving family. This is the point where the trail runs out entirely. No established news outlet has reported this connection in relation to Nolan Wells' case, in any form, at any point. As far as available, verifiable reporting shows, this specific theory exists in one online commentator's account and nowhere else. That doesn't automatically make it false. But it does mean it cannot, at this point in time, be treated as established fact, and presenting it as though it were confirmed would be doing a disservice to everyone genuinely trying to understand this case honestly, including the family at the center of it. There's one more example worth mentioning here, not because it came from the same source as the others, but because of what it reveals, quietly but clearly, about the entire information environment surrounding this case. In the early days after Nolan's death, a claim spread rapidly online suggesting he was a direct descendant of the civil rights journalist and anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells. It gained traction fast, in part because it seemed to add historical weight and symbolic meaning to an already devastating story, connecting one tragedy to another across generations. Members of Ida B. Wells's own family eventually came forward publicly to say the claim simply wasn't true and asked people to stop repeating it. That single, confirmed false story tells you something important about everything else circulating around this case. Misinformation here is not a hypothetical risk that might occur. It has already happened, publicly, and it has already had to be corrected, directly, by the people closest to the truth being distorted. Which means every new claim that surfaces from this point forward, no matter how detailed, how emotionally resonant, or how convincing it sounds on first read, deserves that exact same level of scrutiny before anyone, including you, decides to treat it as fact. A young man's death should not become a canvas for whatever story feels most satisfying to tell. He deserves better than that. And so does the family, still waiting for real answers underneath all of it. So where does that actually leave us, after everything we've laid out tonight? Strip away every unverified document, every unauthenticated claim, every theory that traces back to a single anonymous source with no name attached to it, and here is what remains standing. It is a much shorter list than the internet, at times, would have you believe. But it is a list built entirely on record, sourced and named, and that makes it worth repeating clearly, one final time, without embellishment. Nolan Wells left for Horn Island on the 4th of July, traveling with a group of friends he had known for years. The boat departed that morning, arrived on the island, and he spent the day among roughly 300 people gathered there for the holiday. At some point that afternoon, a call went out reporting the boat was taking on water, a call that has since been reviewed and confirmed as authentic by outlets covering this case. Nolan did not return to the mainland with the group that evening. 2 days later, his body was recovered from the island where he had spent that day. Every part of that sequence is confirmed, sourced, and unchallenged by anyone involved on any side of this story. From there, the record splits into exactly one documented contradiction, and it is worth restating plainly one more time because it is the single piece of this case that carries both names and direct, irreconcilable conflict. One named witness says Nolan told her he intended to leave the island on the boat that evening. The friends who traveled with him say, just as directly and just as publicly, that he chose to stay behind. Both accounts are attributed to real people, willing to put their names behind what they said. Both cannot be true at the same time. And so far, nobody investigating this case has offered any public explanation for why they don't match. Alongside that contradiction sits a second detail, smaller in scale perhaps, but every bit as concrete, and every bit as difficult for a mother to sit with. When Nolan's phone was eventually returned to his family, it contained no saved photos or videos from that day, despite his parents describing that kind of documentation as something close to constant for their son, a habit that defined how he moved through nearly every gathering he ever attended. Investigators, meanwhile, say they have interviewed approximately 60 witnesses connected to the day he disappeared. The FBI has stepped in to assist with digital evidence tied to the case. A reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction has climbed to $125,000, backed by public figures who chose to attach their names and their resources to this cause. And an attorney representing the family has pointed specifically and repeatedly to these exact contradictions as the reason the public deserves far more transparency than it has received so far. That is the confirmed record in its entirety. Every fact within it can be traced to a named source, a documented public statement, or released records from investigators themselves. Nothing more has been established, and nothing less should be accepted as settled, no matter how many times it gets repeated online. Everything beyond that boundary remains unverified. The letter alleging a motive, the claims of altered footage and a hidden fourth boat, the theories connecting this case to political figures and organizations with no confirmed relevance to what actually happened on that island. Some of these claims may, eventually, turn out to hold some truth. That possibility can't be ruled out entirely. But as of right now, none of them have been confirmed by anyone with the authority, the access, or the evidence required to confirm them. And officials in this exact case have already gone on record warning that fabricated material is actively circulating, which means the far more likely outcome for at least some of these claims is precisely the opposite of what their creators are hoping people will believe. This case remains active. No charges have been filed against anyone connected to it. The official cause and manner of Nolan Wells' death remain sealed, withheld deliberately until prosecutors present their findings to a grand jury, a process that carries no announced or predictable timeline. Investigators have not publicly named a suspect. They have not publicly named a person of interest. They have not released a determined cause of death, which means the only honest answer available right now, today, is the simplest one, even though it isn't the satisfying one so many people online seem to be searching for. We don't know. Not fully. Not yet. And anyone telling you otherwise, whether through a handwritten letter with no confirmed author, a video analysis with no outside corroboration, or a theory built on connections no established outlet has ever verified, is asking you to place their confidence above the actual, documented record. In a case involving a real family still waiting every single day for real answers about their son, that kind of confidence should never be handed out for free. It should be earned, sourced, confirmed, the exact same way every fact in this documentary has been built, piece by piece, from the ground up. This case is not finished. In many ways, despite everything already covered tonight, it is still at its beginning. Somewhere in Jackson County right now, an autopsy report already exists. It has been completed, it has been sealed, and it is waiting, along with an entire family and an entire country following this story, for a grand jury process that has no confirmed date attached to it. When that seal eventually lifts, whether through the state's official presentation or through the independent autopsy the family separately requested and had conducted in Washington, D.C., it will provide the first genuine, medical, confirmed answer this case has had since Nolan's body was recovered from that shoreline. Everything discussed in this documentary tonight could shift in an instant the moment that report finally becomes public. We'll be watching for that moment closely, along with any further statements from Jackson County investigators, from the family's legal team, from the sheriff's department, and from any additional federal involvement that becomes public in the weeks ahead. When confirmed, verified information does arrive in this case, and it will, our aim remains exactly what it has been from the first sentence of this documentary, to bring it to you accurately, sourced, and without the noise that has surrounded this story since almost the very beginning. If that's the kind of coverage you want to be here for, subscribe now, because this case is still being written in real time, and the next confirmed update could arrive at any moment, without warning. And before you go, leave a comment, but let's make it count for something more than another guess added to a pile of guesses. Skip the theories. Skip the speculation. Instead, tell us this. Out of everything actually confirmed in this case today, the timeline of that afternoon, the contradiction between two named accounts, the missing photos from a phone that should have been full of them, or the sealed autopsy still waiting on a grand jury, which single detail sits with you the most? Somewhere behind every headline in this case is a mother who still checks her son's phone for something that isn't there. That's the part worth remembering, long after this video ends. That's the conversation worth having, together, while the rest of us wait for the truth, to finally catch up with a story that, for one family, never really ended at all.